The person who ends up with the most control in conversations is rarely the one who talks the most or sounds the smartest. In fact, it's often the opposite. It's the person who seems almost relaxed, like they're not in a hurry to win anything. They're just fine letting the moment breathe. And when you think about it, that's unsettling, because we've been taught our whole lives that clarifying and defending ourselves is what confidence looks like, and that silence feels like weakness. Not responding immediately feels like losing, but somehow, in real life, it never quite works that way. And you've probably felt this without really thinking about it. Someone questions you or challenges something you said, and instantly your body reacts before your brain does. Your thoughts speed up, and you start reaching for explanations, trying to make sure they understand what you meant. It all happens fast. So fast it feels automatic, like you didn't really choose the response. And in the moment, it doesn't feel wrong. It feels like you're standing up for yourself. But later, there's this quiet sense that something didn't go the way you wanted, that you said more than you needed to. What's interesting is that this urge to explain is emotional, and it's very human. We don't explain because the situation needs it. We explain because we feel misunderstood. Not explaining feels like leaving a version of ourselves undefended, and silence in those moments feels like letting someone else define what you said. That's uncomfortable. So we fill the space by talking, trying to clarify and defend ourselves. But there are some people who don't do that. People who, when they're challenged, don't rush to fill the silence or explain themselves. They don't get nervous, and they don't scramble for words. They just let the moment sit. What's different about them has very little to do with intelligence or dominance. It has more to do with how they understand the moment they're in. In most conversations, there's an unspoken sense of who's reacting and who isn't, who's answering questions, and who's deciding which questions matter. And the moment someone starts defending themselves, they step into a role where their words need justification. Without saying it out loud, they accept that they're the one being evaluated. And once that frame is set, everything else follows naturally. You talk more, you think faster, you try harder, and the other person doesn't need to do much at all. They can interrupt, question, nod, or stay quiet, because the work has shifted to you. Psychologically, the person who is explaining is investing cognitive and emotional effort. They're carrying the weight of the conversation, and humans are very sensitive to this, even if they can't articulate it. We subconsciously associate effort with lower status and ease with higher status, not because effort is bad, but because effort signals neediness for approval and understanding. That's why certain conversations feel draining even when nothing overtly hostile is happening. You notice it afterward when the conversation ends, and you realize you said more than you needed to. You keep thinking about why it felt so important in the moment to explain yourself. What makes this tricky is that we're taught the opposite. We're taught that good communication means explaining yourself clearly and being understood. And that's true in some contexts, but not all. Especially not in moments where the real question isn't clarity, but control. Not control over the other person, but control over the direction of the conversation. There's also a deeper emotional layer to this. Explaining yourself is comforting. It gives you the feeling that you're steering the situation, even when you're not. It reduces the anxiety of uncertainty. Silence leaves things unresolved, and it creates space for interpretation. Most people would rather over-explain than sit in that space, because sitting there means trusting yourself enough to not rush to fix anything. Psychologists have known for a long time that open-ended questions change how conversations move. When someone makes a claim and you respond with a simple, neutral question instead of an explanation, the balance quietly flips. Instead of you thinking through your words, they have to slow down and explain what they meant. The conversation stops revolving around your position and starts revolving around theirs. And without pushing back or challenging them, you've shifted where the effort lives. And this is where the one sentence comes in. Not as a trick and not as something clever. It works because it lets you stay where you are instead of rushing to defend yourself. The sentence itself is simple and boring, and that's the whole point. It doesn't push back, and it definitely doesn't explain. It just asks the other person to keep going. And that catches people off guard, because most conversations are built around reaction. People expect either self-defense or agreement. They're not used to someone who doesn't rush into either. When you calmly ask something like, "What makes you say that?" you're not agreeing or explaining. You're just asking them to continue, to make their thinking visible. And in doing so, you quietly take ownership of the conversation. You decide that their statement isn't a conclusion, it's a starting point, something to be examined, and not something you need to react to immediately. What's interesting is how this changes the emotional tone of the interaction. Defensiveness drops, not always instantly, but noticeably. The conversation slows down, and the energy shifts from tension to thought. And even if the other person doesn't realize what's happening, they feel it. They feel that they're now participating in a different kind of exchange. One where they're being listened to, but also gently held accountable for their words. This isn't manipulation. It's the opposite, really. It's removing unnecessary force from the conversation and choosing not to wrestle over meaning, and instead letting meaning reveal itself. That's why people who communicate this way often come across as confident without trying to be. They're not chasing validation or scrambling to be understood. They're comfortable enough to let things unfold. There's also a quiet emotional benefit to this that doesn't get talked about much. When you stop reflexively explaining yourself, you start trusting yourself more. You stop needing every interaction to end in agreement or approval. And you realize that being misunderstood for a moment isn't dangerous. this, that not every comment requires a response. And that realization alone can change how you move through conversations, even when you don't say the sentence at all. Over time, people who rush to explain tend to feel drained after conversations, not because they care less, but because they end up carrying most of the weight. They're present, but they're doing too much. And maybe that's the deeper point here. This isn't really about controlling conversations. It's about choosing where you place your energy, about realizing that not every moment requires output. Some moments require space, and some others require listening. The sentence works because it creates that space, because it slows things down just enough for clarity to emerge, and it shifts the conversation from reaction to reflection. It reminds you that you don't owe immediate explanations to every comment or challenge that comes your way. In a world where everyone is explaining, reacting, and defending, there's something almost steady about being the person who pauses, the one who asks instead of arguing, and who listens without rushing to respond. That kind of presence is rare, and because it's rare, it's deeply valued. So the real power isn't in the sentence itself, it's in what it allows you to do. It lets you stop rushing to fill the silence, and it gives conversations space to play out, instead of forcing them to end right away. And if you ever feel that, you'll stop needing to win conversations or be right immediately. You stop feeling the urge to prove who you are every time someone questions you, and you'll realize that control doesn't come from saying more. It comes from knowing when not to. Sometimes, all it takes is one sentence to remind you of that.